Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. This is Tho Bishop, joined, as always, by our chief editor, Ryan McMaken. And we are talking today about the failures of capitalism once again, or at least that was what came up on the Mises Institute Instagram page over the past week. A few people pointing to the really horrific images from Ohio of the train derailment, which brought hundreds of thousands of pounds of extremely toxic chemicals. They end up, as part of that derailment, the officials there did a controlled burn, which, from what I understand, was perfectly within the protocol there to help prevent greater risks in terms of water tables and things like that. And sure enough, again, you have very confident Instagram socialists pointing to this and saying, well, see, golly gosh darn, this is exactly why we need more government. Once again, we're seeing the consequences of capitalism run amok. These private trains and these private chemical companies have free carte blanche to do whatever they want. And because of that, because of our unregulated high capitalist economy, the people of Ohio and their around it are suffering from the fallout of this very devastating pollution event. And so obviously within something this complicated, there are a number of different issues there, and there are still details coming in and out. The lack of news coverage about this early on is itself an interesting component here. But Ryan, as someone who has written on the topic of the libertarian view of pollution, is that what we truly believe? Is allowing hundreds of thousands of chemicals to be thrown around and burned by, as long as a big company, big corporation, as long as it's privatized? Is that really the libertarian Rothbardian approach to an issue of this magnitude?
Well, obviously not, right? Or we wouldn't be bringing it up.
I want to keep that in the closet somewhere.
Yeah, we'd be avoiding the topic. But of course, that's not the reality of free market thinking, laissez-faire thinking, liberal thinking in the true sense. Of course, free market people think that people who commit harm against other people should be punished and restrained from continuing to do that activity. And this has been the case for a long, long time. It's just the solution offered is different, of course, than what the pro-interventionist regulatory people think. And what an interesting dynamic has come out of this is that when you start to dive down and really look at what is the suggested solution, it turns out that the free market people, at least of the Rothbardian variety, are far less tolerant of pollution and putting poison in the soil and in the water than are the mainstream regulation types, because they all look at not at what actual harms were suffered by any particular people, but at what is a socially optimal or what is an efficient level of pollution. And interestingly, this contrast was outlined in some detail back in 2016, and I think that was the last time we really treated this topic with at any extensive level at Mises.org. But it was Tyler Cowen, who I do not consider to be libertarian or anything like that, but has a decent understanding of how it works. And he noted that Paul Krugman was freaking out about something at the time, it doesn't even matter, about inflation or about pollution, and saying, well, if these free market people had their way, there would just be pollution everywhere all the time, because as long as big business does it, they can poison as many people as they want. And Cowen pointed out that contrary to what Krugman seemed to be thinking, if you took the Rothbardian position on this, it would be far more costly to big business and to polluters than would the sort of regulatory state that Krugman supports. And I'll just quote what Cowan says here back in 2016. He says, Krugman's position is the opposite of the correct criticism. And so Cowan's setting up a criticism of the Rothbardian people anyway, but it's a different one from Krugman's. The main problem with classical libertarianism is that it doesn't allow enough pollution. Under libertarian theory, pollution is a form of violent aggression that should be banned, as Murray Rothbard insisted numerous times. Okay, but what about actual practice once all those special interest groups start having their say, that is, the people who want to punish the polluters? Historically, under the more limited government of the 19th century, it was big business that wanted to move away from the unpredictable local and litigation-driven methods of control, that is, actual tort cases in the court system, and toward a more, this is what big business wanted, they wanted to move toward a more systematic regulatory approach at the national level. So what this means is that business has wanted the regulation. They've wanted sort of this managed level of pollution because it's set into place a tolerable, legally tolerable amount of pollution that you could actually pump into the environment and then be covered and not have to worry about some guy downstream who you might have poisoned his farm or his fish hatchery, who knows what. And then it's up to the courts to determine in that specific case how much harm needs to be paid out and so on. Instead, what they wanted was a regulatory state that said, oh, well, we have determined this is the acceptable amount of pollution. As long as you stay below this, then you're more or less covered legally, unless we can prove negligence or some other issue like that. So it actually, by adopting the regulatory approach, rather than the Rothbardian approach, you're setting up a system where punishments can actually potentially be much, much higher against polluters, and it's limited by state regulation instead. And we're told by Cowan that that's actually the correct approach, that he doesn't like Rothbardianism either because it's too stringent. He thinks that the government should determine what the socially optimal level then and quote-unquote efficient level of pollution then is. Because if you just let everybody sue people who poison the water, well, those big businesses would just completely go out of business, and we can't have that. So there's this belief that government needs to artificially create these legal environments where people can actually poison you, but that we've determined as a society we should tolerate that poisoning because it's good for everybody. So you can see the competing views there, whereas, of course, I happen to agree with the Rothbardian view. Look, if you poison people, you should look out for that, and you should be held accountable. And you might have to endure big payouts, but that's what insurance companies are for. And if you can't be trusted to take proactive steps to avoid poisoning people, well, then you can't get insurance, and that's your problem. That's not, quote unquote, society's problem. So just in those, that's just kind of this basic outline there, that this critique of libertarianism as just being fine pollution is actually, it's the opposite. That is true, and the concern over decades has been how to create a way to allow for more pollution while still, quote unquote, holding companies accountable somehow. And so you can take your pick there. You can debate which one you want. The Rothbardian one, however, I think objectively is the more stringent standard.
And of course, even with a situation like this, when we're dealing with chemical fallout that is not kind of the byproduct of normal output from a factory, right, or something like that. It's not. The nuclear power plant has made some backroom deal with the shady politician to authorize, cartoonish nuclear waste. That's bright green, being pumped in and killing all the fishes. As part of just the normal standard operating procedure. We're dealing with an emergency event, a catastrophe. In the sense of a train derailment. But even there is this dynamic to which, there is a level of government. For one, as someone who lives down here in the Gulf of Mexico, that once upon a time was picking up tar balls after the BP oil spill, explosion down here back in 2010 or whenever that was. I have a pretty good feeling that the result of all of this is going to be the train company involved, Norfolk Southern, right? They're going to they benefit from government protections in terms of the liability that they will face in terms of damages, both in terms of the immediate impact and the long-standing consequences. I know there's tremendous fears right now about long-term health consequences to those affected, both in the immediate vicinity, both in terms of long-term exposure in water and things like that. The concerns about future, cancer clusters and byproducts there. Again, the government system that we have right now is built towards with the benefit to these large corporations in mind in terms of the actual liability, the exposure that they will have to this, rather than what we would have in a more private, Rothbardian, a tort-focused environment. The other side of this equation is that I know there's a very interesting discussion going on about train brake systems and how the trains that Norfolk Southern was using, particularly in this instance, had a more outdated mode rather than some of the more modern advancements in terms of train braking, both of which, so they were kind of skirting right into whatever the government said they had to do. I know there's part of the brouhaha is I think the Trump administration rescinded or stopped an Obama-era rule dealing with train safety enforcement that would have required this sort of different braking system there. And so the problem is you have these companies that are doing up to the bare minimum of what the regulatory bodies themselves are saying and receive a level of protection because they are doing what the manager class has deemed the cost-effective way of handling this business. And again, so the downside here, facing these companies, the long-term liability for these, for the damage done by these decisions the company has made, and again, no matter how unforeseen a train derailment may be, again, it's the government that's actually protecting this sort of corporate behavior. And I can't think of a better illustration of that. Out of curiosity, I looked at the current stock price for Norfolk Southern Corporation, and currently their stock price, while a bit down over where it was on before the accident. If you look at February 2nd, it was about $252 a share. Currently, it's hovering around $240. That is still higher than it was back in October of 2022 before a major disaster. And if that is not a demonstration of the market viewing that the damages from this incident are not going to be entirely borne by the company, I can't imagine what is. Again, if people are, if that is, again, there's some very savvy calculations here on exactly what is the real the real risk here. And again, it's because of the interventions within this economy, rather than the free market not caring about the real life consequences and again the horrific humanitarian toll that an incident like this is really going to have on the community of East Palestine.
Well, it's very important to remember whenever you're talking about the railroads, and of course nowadays in America, most industries, and especially anything that deals with finance or heavy industry, it's heavily regulated already by usually the federal government for these large industries. In fact, railroads were the first really private industry brought under a regulatory umbrella by the federal government. And that was back, in the middle of the 19th century, just at the very early days of the American, the federal regulatory state. And so all along, that's been a big part of the railroads, and especially now, of course, freight lines. And it's currently the Surface Transportation Board that oversees that, but that's just a lot of stuff to do with mergers and pricing and that sort of thing. But of course, it's also all of this railroad stuff is subject to environmental regulations as well, and general safety stuff, which there could be overlaps with other organizations. And so the idea that just like we hear about how, oh man, these unregulated financial markets, these unregulated global financial markets are just running amok, as if those markets were in any way unregulated or even mostly unregulated. It's the same way here with the railroads. And of course, the degree to which it's been regulated has changed over time. Probably the height of it was maybe in the mid to late 20th century, where, boy, the railroads were basically like de facto owned by the government in many ways. But now it's a little bit looser in terms of the regulation, but they're certainly not functioning just under some profit motive and just going and doing whatever they want. Their job, and Per Bieland, if he were here, would explain in some detail how this works and how it distorts markets, is they have to spend at least as much time thinking about how can I please my bureaucratic overlords as how much can I please my customer that I'm serving. So there's no real market motive here that you can point to as the driving force behind what's going on with railroads or any other major industry anytime there's a major accident. That doesn't mean, of course, that they didn't commit negligence or something like that. But this is the sort of thing that gets worked out in the courts, where you need to examine the specific case and what was going on there and what were the specific harms endured by the surrounding communities. And those costs, of course, can be very, very large for the guilty party. But as you note, right, what is the trade-off here that the railroads enjoy, and this is just true across many industries, is it contains the costs once you impose this regulatory system on there. It allows for some more, it provides higher costs overall for the industry because there are all these costs of regulatory compliance. However, the potential for sky-high judgments against the company tend to be limited in these cases, and that's just part of the trade-off that's offered by the federal regulators, is in exchange for this regulation, there will be some limited liability on this so long as you conform to the federal regulation. So like with so much, it allows them to spread the costs around then, not just between the bad actors. So under a tort system, the bad actors would be the one paying out almost all of the reparations, if you will, for laziness, negligence, just mistakes. Whereas now everybody has to share some of these costs of regulation, including companies that could have come up with innovative new ways of avoiding accidents or harm, but they can't go down that path because it doesn't fit with the current regulatory scheme. So these regulatory schemes then drive all of the competitors into a certain way of doing things. Those actually aren't necessarily the safest and best way to do things. They're just decided upon by government regulators. But the benefit is a more predictability than in the overall cost should there be accidents. So you can see why large enterprises, industries, even in the private sector, would like that. And so that's just certainly the current relationship that we have between large industries and government regulation in many, many cases. But it's just important to take away here that these are not unregulated industries by any stretch. And they're constantly working with these regulatory industries over what should be done. And it's easy to just say, oh, they weren't regulated enough. But the fact of the matter is that that's something to take up then with the federal government. If you're going to place a significant degree of the responsibility for this in the hands of the feds, they also should be the ones that are held responsible. Unfortunately, if you sue the government for this sort of thing in court, it's just the taxpayers that end up paying rather than a private company. So in the end, the government isn't actually held responsible because none of the federal officers involved in this are ever held personally liable. And of course, the federal government is not going to go out of business no matter how big a judgment you put out against them.
And doesn't this kind of seem, and it's something I've been kind of chewing on during the week so far. I mean, there's been so many crazy headlines out here, and luckily, we're talking about train derailments and not UFOs or nuclear war, which is a plus. But it kind of just and I don't know if maybe I'm just getting to that age where these are sort of natural views of things, but it kind of just feels like we are just kind of watching the slow, just gradual decay of sort of American infrastructure, American industry, things like that, and it just feels like there are all of these secondary consequences of, the monetary hedonism, the financialization of the economy, where, so much of the attention is spent on the financial aspect of these companies as investments, that they're very much, it seems, does get a disconnect between the money questions and the wealth management side and the actual, production of goods and services. I know within the example here of this specific incidents, one of the criticisms that has come up is that Norfolk Southern, as many such cases, was doing significant stock buybacks rather than investing in better breaks and things like that. I mean, of course, and we've seen this play out kind of in a variety of different corporate stories out there. The larger narrative being a lot much more fixation on the stock buybacks and the ways in which the current executive class sees their compensation goes up at the expense of labor or working conditions or innovations or the quality of the goods and services. And again, I think this goes into just the larger kind of just cloud hanging over the economy. We've talked in the past about the managerial aspect of the current global economy. We've talked about, again, the consequences of financialization. We've ranted about the Fed's policies, many times, and we'll do so again in the future. But it feels like these are just kind of a little bit on the edges, where the real life consequences of a fiat economy and the disconnect here. Because once upon a time, the people that were really running railroads and chocolate companies, and you watch some of those series on like the men or the companies or that made America, right? You get people whose entire livelihoods were focused on the actual production of real things, whereas so many of the current class of corporate decision makers are almost replaceable in the industry that they're in, because their focus is so much more on the financial side of things. And so, that is my own take of an old man rant at this point, perhaps, Ryan. But do you think that there's an element here where this, again, this crazy financial world, is perhaps kind of having some an effect here in the ways that, again, I think a lot of Americans just kind of maybe feel in their gut more than they can explain rationally?
Yeah, I've often wondered that myself. It's always so hard, that issue of, boy, are things more run down than they than they used to be? Just because I guess once you've been an adult for 20 years or so, you have memories of these things where, boy, that didn't seem so run down. But I wonder if I just didn't notice back then. So I don't know if just my memory is skewed. And it's hard to look at the empirical data because there's so many different ways to compare it or metrics to use and things like that. But I mean, there is no denying that there were huge amounts of infrastructure spending that did occur in the middle of the 20th century, just because of that was what was politically popular. A lot of it was driven by Cold War spending, where we need all of this new infrastructure that might be useful in case of World War III. That was a big issue. All that dam building done under the Roosevelt administration, projects that could not even be afforded today. And when you go and you look at what it would cost to create something like the Hoover Dam today, it's just simply out of reach financially. Part of that is because people died building that, and it was very dangerous, and the environmental impact was huge, and they didn't care about any of that back then. So huge costs would be imposed on the same sort of project today. Maybe there's a lesson to be learned there. I don't know. But yeah, I think when you start thinking about the issue of capital expenditure, right? Is capital expenditure as profitable as financial investment? And just moving your money around, putting it in government bonds or in low-risk financial investments of some kind. because that's what you see a lot of. And this brings us back yet again to this issue of financialization, which I think is one of the most ignored but very important issues of our time over the last 35 years or so, is this issue of, rather than putting money into a new factory, rather than putting money into newly trained labor, I can just put this money, I can park it in a certain place where I know I'm going to collect a certain amount on it because of these low risk financial investments that have been made available by the central bank and by the financial system, which has really just been turned toward valuing financial gains rather than actual gains from expanding your factory or from building more cars or having more efficient machine tools, that sort of thing. And that is a real issue. It's difficult to see just how much it has affected spending on infrastructure or on just even these private companies and how much have they developed their own tools and resources. I think we would all benefit from some additional Misesian or Rothbardian investigations of those topics, for sure. But I think that's certainly part of it. The stock buyback is certainly an issue, right? Rather do that than invest in capital expenditure because simply that's just more profitable. And so, yeah, why so little emphasis on physical things that could actually make our lives better? And of course, there's some emphasis on it, right? It's not like there hasn't been any gains in aviation in the last 20 years. Even if the planes do look more or less the same, they're not more or less the same, right? There are some what are seemingly invisible changes in progress and that are substantial. However, I think you could argue that the capital expenditure would be much greater without so much focus on the financial sector, and where you can see that's lower risk, higher potential profit because of the way the banking and sector and the financial sector have been constructed, thanks in many ways to financial regulation and the central bank. So does this come back to that issue? I think it very well could, but to what extent, I'm just not sure, but I think it's something that we should look out for. And it does seem that these are the sorts of problems that should be easy to solve, right? Coming up with infrastructure that works well. There are lots of things, I had a great professor, I think I've quoted this on here before, who said once that the easy to solve problems were already solved a long time ago. So now we're debating over the harder stuff. But it would seem that coming up with railroad transportation that's a little bit safer and more efficient should be easier. But I'm sure if you talk to someone in the industry, they'll be like, no. Here's the reason why you're wrong, and here's all the gains that have been made. I mean, these are technical questions, but I do know that a ton of money is sucked out by the financialization issue. And then also a lot of the brightest minds are sucked out just by the government sector in general, right? They're really driving up prices, labor costs of engineers, who countless engineers are more engaged in building weapons than in building the infrastructure, because the U.S. government bids up those prices, because that's where so much of the demand is. And you can make a lot more money by working at a government contractor than working in something that's more private sector than that. So there is a crowding out effect. There is a draining of both investment in labor and in capital expenditure that's being taken out of the private sector and moved toward the government sector as the government grows, and also as the load and the size of the financial sector grows, just in part to all that government debt that's out there, the $30 trillion in government debt that's out there, that just creates this huge pool of financial assets that require managers and which can build up whole financial classes around them. So this is a big deal that most people don't think of that. They just think in terms of, well, what environmental regs can we impose now on these railroads, and that'll solve the problem. But unfortunately, it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, well, luckily, while our plane technology might be improving over time, there's a lot of emphasis now in that industry to prioritize things besides skill when it comes to staffing pilot jobs and air traffic control. So I'm sure that won't have any consequences in the future in terms of their operations either. One last thing here, and it kind of notes with the lamenting of how good they had it back in the day in terms of building big projects. Again, not that we necessarily endorse. Noting that we explicitly do not endorse big Roosevelt-style spending, but obviously environmentalists play a larger role now in terms of managing what sort of projects are allowed and what are not, and that's one of the ironies I find here. While the chemicals being in this specific instance, are not ones that you would send through pipelines. It is interesting that a lot of the obviously the energy focus, the protest focus when it comes to natural gas pipelines and the like have been on stopping dreaded pipelines, which are a lot safer. You do not have you have to worry about brakes on a pipeline. So there's an additional element here where environmentalist concerns and some of these secondary and third things help structure the transportation that certain industries end up using that have all sorts of secondary side effects as well. I know it's not a particularly big issue here, and obviously, we have seen with some of the recent reports from Seymour Hersh that pipelines too can have their own episodes if the American military decides they don't quite like what you're selling to who you're selling it to, or at least the political leverage you might have on who you're selling it to. But that's just another, I think, aspect of this larger conversation is again, the degree to which environmental regulations also kind of can lead to different areas of more at-risk, less, let's say, optimal means of transporting goods and services. Because, I mean, that is a big aspect in here, is that the whole reason why trains and trucks and the logistics throughout America are important is because, I mean, the ability to move large quantities of very important materials around this very large continent. I mean, that is what allows for incredible miracles, right? There is not a solution here that simply says, oh, we shouldn't be transporting, things that might go boom if something bad happens, right? These are necessary for the production of all sorts of incredible things. So the more that it is that the government manipulated or influenced or completely controlled by interests that are not the well-being of human beings, I think particularly in the case of environmentalism, which I think is thinly veiled as an anti-human cult at this point, or just kind of secondary concerns. I mean, and some of these are explicit special interest concerns as well. To the kind of the self-interest of powerful business villains, but the more that the decisions about how we transport these sort of chemicals, allowing that more to genuine market forces rather than having that being controlled and regulated by the state, that's another way of making a less fragile transportation process for this sort of stuff, even though that might itself not be particularly in the cards with this specific incident.
Well, and there's so little is actually known at the moment as to what the takeaway is going to be and what the narrative is going to be. Obviously, some people are going to tell us that it's all the railroad's fault. But maybe it's good in that it'll spur a better conversation of what sort of government regulation is taking place here and what motivations are going on. I mean, who benefits from what regulations and what is being done. I do find it remarkable, however, that the federal government has mentioned it so little, and I wonder if this had happened under Trump, how much would the media be focusing on it then, because it seems there's just so little attention being paid right now. Now, again, I don't know the degree, how horrible the situation is. I'm not there, and I speak from experience on how we've had forest fires in Colorado, right? And if you watch the evening news, it sounds like the entire state is ablaze when that's happening. So it's real hard to interpret the facts from afar, but it doesn't look like nothing has happened. It looks like real harm has occurred, and it would be interesting to have some reliable information on it, but that's actually remarkably difficult to get.
Yeah, you do have to really, hats off to Mayor Pete Buttigieg, the transportation secretary. that, I mean, days after this crisis. So it's not like, he didn't get the word right, and someone has to deliver the speech, the talk that when Bush was reading during 9/11, and someone has to go to Mayor Pete and says, there's been an incident in East Palestine, Ohio, right? I mean, like days after this event, when there's no coverage of this from the federal level, whatsoever. I mean, you have Pete Buttigieg, out there doing public events, discussing the need to have greater diversity on construction sites, which from my own personal experience, that's one area of the American economy where there's plenty of diversity, usually out there already through various other market means already. But can you imagine, like, the transportation secretary position is usually not one that we think about a whole lot. I had to remind myself earlier that it was actually Mitch McConnell's wife that was the transportation secretary during I think more or less the entirety of the Trump administration. But it seems between train derailments and plane delays and the shipping barges off the coast of California. I mean, I'm not going to say that it's all Mayor Pete's fault, but I'm also saying that I don't think this is something that he really wants on his resume the next time he runs for president, which is inevitable. He has handled this about as well as his presidential run. And it's just, I'm just interested to see what comes up next for our wonderful transportation department and Pete Buttigieg's heavy-handed guidance here.
Well, it also just drives home. I mean, I don't know how much longer they're going to keep telling me that the federal government is so much better at regulation than either markets or more localized units of government. What does the federal government suffer when something off the coast of California or something in West Virginia goes wrong? They have no skin in the game. This is like a perfect demonstration of that, and so it means basically nothing to them. Say they enrage all the voters of Ohio, that barely even hurts the Democratic Party, which hasn't won Ohio in a while. So it's really quite remarkable as to just how the whole system is constructed in such a way that a lot of these more localized events, they're really not a problem for the federal government at all. So all we have to do is rely on the good conscience of federal regulators to do the right thing, and that seems like a pretty bad plan.
And one of the other interesting incidents here, again, just how weird the narrative is. Apparently, there was a Netflix movie about a train derailment and the chaos that comes about that actually was based near East Palestine, Ohio. And apparently people in East Palestine, Ohio were actually like extras in the movie. Just very weird. If any of our listeners goes down the rabbit hole and watches, I believe it's White Noise or something like that. I want to hear your thoughts on the Netflix train derailment episode, Tho at Mises.org. Let me know your thoughts on this. Again, it's just very, very weird how the news cycle works at times. But Ryan, I think that this has been I think that punk socialist on Instagram has been thoroughly owned as part of this episode. So I appreciate your help on that. For Ryan McMaken, this is Tho Bishop. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.